Everybody, thank you so much for coming and sharing your lunchtime or morning or evening with us. I'm Elizabeth Wilson. I'm the director of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth, and I'm here with colleagues today to share our new book, thanks to Philippe Torell. The way we'll work is Philippe will give a brief introduction of the project. Each of the different chapter co-authors that are with us today will speak for 6 minutes, and then we'll be fielding your questions. So if you want to type your questions, Stephanie, who's up in the corner, will be getting them. If you could put who your question is addressed to as it's addressed, and I'll be reading them out, and we'll be directly answering them after we've had the talk. And we've tried to structure so we have a lot of time for back and forth. And with that, Philippe.
Hi, good morning or afternoon or evening, everyone. First, I'd like to start by thanking Elizabeth for suggesting that we do this and for the wonderful support team at Dartmouth who made it happen on such short notice. And of course, I want to thank the panelists who are joining us, and as well the other authors and contributors to the book, many of whom I see have joined on. So thank you all. Of course, without you, this would not have happened. I'm going to take just a few minutes to give you some background about the genesis of the project and the book, and some of the connections that were built through the process of assembling this wonderful team of authors. The project goes back for me to sort of a pivot I think I had in my career maybe 6, 7 years ago. A number of different things happened around that time. I became a full professor at UBC, and I figured I had sort of nowhere left to go in terms of the academic rank. And it felt like an interesting time to explore what I could do to move beyond building domain expertise and disciplinary expertise, to think a little bit more broadly and to assume some responsibilities that I felt were now upon me to move beyond strictly academic things and try to develop some impact beyond the walls of the university. That was around the time that I started working in the high Canadian Arctic. I'm an oceanographer by training and a professor at UBC. I guess I didn't say that, the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And at the time that I started working in the Arctic, I initially approached that with very much of a scientific focus. I am an oceanographer. I go to sea on ships, and we measure all kinds of variables in the oceans. And that was for many years the lens through which I had seen my craft and my work. But as I began to work in the Arctic, it became apparent immediately that there were direct and immediate impacts of that scientific understanding for communities who lived in the Arctic and depended upon ecosystems to sustain their livelihood and cultural practices. And through a relatively rapid process, I became much more aware, much more in tune with the implications of science for broader societal implications and communities. And that was around the time that I also became a scholar at something called the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies at UBC. And within a couple of years of that, I became director of the Institute. In a nutshell, the Institute aims to foster interdisciplinary collaborations across all different fields. We connected people across UBC and from around the world to come together and address complicated problems from these multifaceted perspectives. And of course, my experience in the Arctic had convinced me that there were many problems like that really required expertise across fields to make significant progress. And one of the things I had the opportunity to do as the director of the Institute was to facilitate those kinds of conversations. My first or maybe second year at the Institute was 2017. That was the year that Canada celebrated its sesquicentennial, 150th anniversary of Confederation. And it was a time when people across the country were really beginning to consider what the country had achieved, what it had meant, but also to reflect on some of its darker historical legacies. And it was in that spirit that I felt we had an opportunity to bring together some smart people from across the country to reflect on what the nation meant at that moment in its history. And that resulted in the publication of my first edited book called Reflections of Canada. And it was a really interesting experience to bring people together and to see what would happen when ideas were allowed to intermingle freely. And it was actually such a good experience that the following year I decided to have another kick at the can. It was 2018, and I'd become aware, or was known to me, that 2018 was going to mark the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, which in Canada and the Commonwealth is celebrated as Remembrance Day. And taking that anniversary as a catalyst, we then put together another book with a different collection of authors called Memory. And it was a really broad reflection on memory and remembrance in many, many different contexts, not just human memory, but Earth system memory, interstellar memory. And it was, again, a fascinating romp and exploration through all these ideas. Now, shortly after Memory was released, for reasons I won't go into now, I ended up resigning as director of the Institute, and I found myself, I won't say exactly adrift, but I found myself with some time on my hands and some ideas sort of without venue of expression. And I thought, you know, maybe what I need is to just try to do another book. And what I'd learned with the first two was that anniversaries can be significant points in time when people will focus their attentions, at least for a moment, a month, among the scatter and hype of all the media that we're exposed to. When we come to these pivotal anniversaries, and people tend to like round numbers, 10 and 50 and 100 and so on, it does create an opportunity for some interesting conversation. And it's not an exaggeration to say I literally just went on the web and searched for milestone anniversaries in 2020, and one of the first things that came up was Earth Day. And actually this, of all the things I'd done, was something I actually knew something about as an oceanographer. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And I started reading a little bit about Earth Day and looking at some fantastic vintage video clips on the web, and realizing what a perfect confluence of science and society and economics and law this was, and what a wonderful opportunity it would be to bring together another terrific group of people and have them reflect on what has happened to planet Earth over the last 50 years, not just from a biophysical sense, but how our societies have evolved to adapt to and hopefully mitigate some of the changes that we've inflicted on the planet. And with those sort of marching orders, I quickly assembled a cast of fantastic contributors to the book, 4 of which you're going to hear from today. And I've been working closely with them over the last number of months, and the result is the book that you have perhaps seen on the screen, and in due course will get in your hands as a hard copy, should you choose to do that. So that is really all I'd like to say for introduction. I'd like to now turn it over to our speakers, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they're saying and to interacting with all of you. I was delighted to see a strong interest and a large number of participants. So our first speaker will be Professor Deboarh McGregor. She's an associate professor and Canada Research Chair at York University. She works at the forefront of Indigenous environmental justice and Indigenous research theory and practice. From the very get-go of this book, it was extremely important to me that we have strong representation of Indigenous worldviews. After all, Earth Day is a relatively modern concept to Western societies, whereas environmental notions are deeply embedded over thousands of years of Indigenous culture and practice. And so that was an area that was absolutely critical. And UBC has a strong group of Indigenous scholars, but wanting to branch out a little bit beyond university, I started asking around for people who could really address this with eloquence and authority. And a number of people pointed me to Deborah, so I was delighted when she accepted the offer to join us, and I'll now have her give some reflections about her contribution. Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you for that context and for doing all this work to put this together. I think I'll just start with because, you know, I look at it as Earth Week as opposed to just Earth Day, which was, I guess, on Wednesday, depending on where you are on the planet. It would have been the day before, the day after. It's just also just acknowledging the lands and the territories that we're on as well, and not only acknowledging the Indigenous peoples there, but also what people would call the non-human world, what I would call from an Anishinaabe perspective, our other relatives who are also caretakers for the lands and waters and territories that we now enjoy. That sets a little bit of the stage for just some remarks that I want to share about the chapter that I contributed. Beautiful work, by the way. Like I love the whole thing, and trying to stay within 5 minutes to do it. So I wanted to start by saying that the work that I did was really trying to show the recognition of Indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, initially with the very first Earth Days, Indigenous peoples weren't formally involved in it, but then as some scholars like Daniel Wildcat would say, he would say, well, every day was Earth Day from an Indigenous worldview and ontological perspective. So in terms of the approach that I take around Indigenous knowledge systems, legal systems, and governance systems is a recognition that there's diversity across the planet in terms of Indigenous peoples. So we know that, but at the same time, there's also commonality. Like one of the things that I found that's common, and you see these evident in the Indigenous environmental declarations that have come out every time there's like world meetings, UN meetings around, environmental issues, including climate change, is this idea of having an obligation and responsibility to the earth itself. How our idea of the earth or Mother Earth is thought about and related to in a very different way. And this relationship is also reciprocal. Like we also rely on, the earth relies on us, and then we also rely on the earth. There's this obligation that we have in relation to the earth that's reflected in our legal orders. And as you know, relationships require work. Like you have to work on relationships with the earth every day and meet our obligations. It's not something that we could do when it's convenient or when we feel like it, but it's something that has to happen every day. So then I turn to the status quo, and the status quo clearly is not really working all that well. The time we're living in right now could be a pivotal moment in thinking through how do we want to be different. Like I'm thinking we don't really want to go back to normal because normal isn't sustainable. So what do we vision for our future? So the status quo is problematic, and it's not delivering on a sustainable world or future. And Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous people's knowledge is becoming a lot more relevant to what can this future look like? What can this transformation look like? What can we do? How can we do things differently? And that's a major paradigm shift. Very early on in a lot of the early global environmental gatherings, Indigenous peoples were this problem that had to be solved. Very vulnerable people, marginalized, which is true, but also now they have something to contribute. That's a major shift in that I started to see with the Brundtland report and the Earth Summit that happened in Rio, the first one in 1992. So these really started to have an influence. I probably have a couple minutes left. Like, what are these advances that happen when this paradigm shift occurred roughly, 4 decades ago? One of them is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, how that can also be used as a framework to move forward to a sustainable future. The Declaration on Mother Earth as a Living Entity in 2010. I see these kind of innovations as really critical and important because they really point to a shift in how we understand our relationship with the earth itself. So this idea of living well with the earth, this concept recognizes the agency of the earth itself, returning to a dialogue with Mother Earth, Indigenous peoples wanting to share their knowledge and legal traditions and ideas around how we can move to a more equitable and reciprocal relationship with the earth. So every day we'd be thinking about what can our gift be back to the earth, as opposed to how the earth has to continually give back to us. So what we see emerging now is our new ways of thinking that are gaining more credence, and that's like earth jurisprudence, earth justice, wild law, and this is where nature or aspects of nature like rivers or mountains start gaining legal personality, start being recognized as having rights in and of themselves. So I just wanted to end this in thinking about where we've been, the moment that kind of we're in now, and where we could go in the next 50 years. And I'm thinking what I would like to see more relevant in our conversations is actually being able to enable these relationships with the earth itself. So we're not just celebrating Earth Day as a separate thing from us, but actually with the earth itself, and understanding the earth is having its own agency, and we have this obligation, reciprocal obligation. I'd also like to see love as being part of that conversation. This is like, we talk about it all the time in Indigenous circles. Like, it's a very relevant thing, concept to be having in our way of thinking, in terms of what are we going to do to show our love for the earth? What does that look like today, next week, 10 years from now, 50 years from now? What does our love look like for the earth and for future generations? So I think my 5 minutes are up, and hopefully that gave you a taste of that chapter. And again, thank you for joining us and for listening. Chibigwech.
Thank you very much, Deborah. What a wonderful place to end, and then to begin new conversations. So we will hold the questions for everyone until the end, and I will move on to introducing our next speaker, who is Dr. Tapio Schneider, who is a climate scientist at Caltech. He is currently leading the Climate Modeling Alliance, which is a multi-institutional collaboration building a new climate model that is learning automatically from data using advanced machine learning methods. Tapio is someone, unlike many of the authors, that I did have a connection to before the book. We were graduate students together in the same department back in the early 1990s during the days of the early IPCC reports. And so we knew each other quite well and probably had not seen each other for near 20 years until he visited UBC to give a seminar in my department last year, right around the time when I was preparing the final list of authors. And we went for coffee and we chatted about this and that. I mentioned the book, and to my delight, he agreed on the spot, if I'm not mistaken, to contribute a chapter. And so I'm delighted to introduce him and to give him the floor to share some remarks.
Thanks, Philippe. Yeah, so my expertise is in climate science. I entered the field in the mid-90s as a grad student, which is when I met Philippe. And I've been involved with the science for now 25 years. The 50th anniversary of Earth Day, it's close to my lifetime, a little bit younger, but not by much. So it was a good time to reflect both on 50 years of climate on Earth, which happens to coincide with my years on Earth, more or less. And although I've been in this business for a long while now and have been thinking about climate since high school times, it still astonishes me every day how much climate is changing and how quickly it is changing. If there's a silver lining to what we are currently going through, is that I think people are starting to appreciate what exponential growth means a bit more than they did before. I used to say to my children and everyone who wanted to hear it, I just wish more people would understand the exponential function, and we would be so much better in planning and preparing for what is to come. So exponential growth, we also have had, for example, in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. It's just one metric, an easy metric to use to illustrate how much we have changed our environment. So CO2 in the atmosphere, we had about 270 parts per million for the last 10,000 or so years before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It was just wiggling up and down a bit, but 270 was more or less the value. That's when humans developed agriculture, civilization, cities, all those things. Climate was very stable during that time. And then in the late 1800s, concentration started to slowly creep up at first because of industrialization, burning of fossil fuels. By the beginning of the 20th century, it was around 295 or so parts per million, so 25 parts per million more. By the first Earth Day, we were at 320 parts per million, so that's 20% above the pre-industrial levels. At the time, it was clear that can affect climate. At the time, it was clear that that could be something we have to worry about at some point, but it was 20% above pre-industrial values. It was not an acute concern, perhaps, and it wasn't the acute concern driving Earth Day, which was much more concerned, the first Earth Day, which was much more concerned with local pollution, air pollution, and the like, where we have made great strides. Air quality throughout the Western world is much better than it was in the 1970s. So we were at 320 parts per million, 20% above pre-industrial levels in 1970. Now it's about 450 parts per million. So this is more than 50% above pre-industrial levels. And what this means, all the CO2 that has accumulated in the atmosphere, now comes from human emissions. There's no ambiguity about it. And what it means is that in the last 50 years, we have added more than twice as much carbon dioxide to the atmosphere than in all of human history before. Just the last 50 years. And it's exponential growth. The concentration keeps increasing. Of course, there's been technological progress, but so far, economic growth, which is the main driver of emissions, has outpaced the technological progress. Concentrations keep going up, even emissions keep going up currently. There's not even a peak in sight. Well, there is a sharp blip right now for obvious reasons, but we'll get through the current pandemic. Once we're through that, I think we'll be back to the rapid growth that we have seen over the last 150 years, and most rapid really over the last few decades. To make this a bit more intuitive, every one of us puts about the weight equivalent of 10 mid-sized passenger cars of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year, children, adults included. So this is the scale of the problem. Every one of us, it's about the weight of 10 cars. So somehow we either have to eventually get that out, stop emitting that is the first step. And we have to get there in a way that's not disruptive on a massive scale. Right now, we see a massive reduction in emissions. It might be as much as 50%, but obviously the price we pay here is much too high. I mean, that's not an acceptable solution to shut down the economy to save the environment. So CO2 has gone up, temperatures have gone up by a little more than 1 degree centigrade since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and all of those trends keep continuing. And while in 1970 you could think about climate change as a distant problem, by the time Philippe and I were in graduate school, I think it was becoming an acute problem. We were talking a lot at the time about mitigating climate change, what we can and should do to prevent further increases in CO2 concentrations, to mitigate climate change. We still have to do that. That conversation hasn't ended, but the thing that has profoundly changed even since 1995 to now is that mitigation is not going to be enough. Climate is changing, climate will be changing profoundly. Irrespective of policy decisions made now, there is just a long lag in whatever policy decisions we make to seeing changes in climate. And we just also need to adapt to those changes. We need to adapt the infrastructure we built to the climate changes that are coming. We need to, some parts of the world, we need to think about whether humans can still live there, whether that's in low-lying areas near oceans or say in the Arctic. Obviously people can still live there, but the changes there are dramatic. While we've had about 1 degree of temperature increase over the last century globally in the global mean, over land it's closer to 1.5 degrees. In the Arctic, in some areas it's 3 or 4 degrees, and more in winter temperature increase that we have already seen. So that affects the permafrost, it affects how people are living there, how it affects ecosystems obviously, and the like. So these are all changes that are already happening, of which we'll get more intense rainfall. This will be one consequence, and we'll have to figure out how to live with it, in addition to figuring out how to prevent more of these changes from happening. As Philippe mentioned, I work in a climate modeling project. Our goal here is to provide the information we need to adapt to climate change, and perhaps also to help mitigate it. Although the mitigation problem is primarily a policy and technology problem, it's not so much a problem of providing predictions of how climate changes. It's clear we just have to figure out how to produce energy without emitting carbon. That's the bottom line for the bottom line agenda. The top line agenda item for the next 50 years must be that. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tapio, and that will tie in nicely to Elizabeth's final remarks on energy. But before we get there, I would like to introduce Professor Sheila Jasanoff. Professor Jasanoff is I'll just pull it up here, is a four-timer professor of science and technology studies at Harvard University's Kennedy School. Her work explores the role of science and technology in law, politics, and the policy of modern democracy. She has authored many articles and edited or authored up to 15 books. She was someone that I did not know before, but was again recommended by a large number of people, including my own colleague, Hadi Haladabati, who is a friend of Sheila's. And I think had he not been a friend, I think I probably would not have been able to get through the hundreds of requests that I believe she gets all the time. And Hadi said, well, she'd be the best one to do this if there's a chance that she'll even possibly say yes. So when Sheila did agree to do this, I was pleased, as I was with all of the authors, and I am pleased to welcome her to this conversation today.
Thank you, Philippe, and let me also add my thanks to you for pulling this wonderful book and collection of people together. And this is, one of the sort of optimistic aspects of an otherwise dark moment that nevertheless, in spite of being virtualized and being turned into what one colleague of mine refers to as postage stamps, we nevertheless are making new friends and are making new connections. And I hope that those things will survive the darkness of the period and lead us to other sorts of things. So you asked me to write about science and environmentalism. And what I wanted to talk about was the way in which science has been absolutely central to the environment, but has pointed to the need to think about the uses of science and technology jointly with other things. So there's been a tradition in particularly Western philosophy. I mean, I think that this was already called attention to earlier, that other cultures have not made for this kind of separation between nature and culture. But in Western thinking, I mean, the idea that facts belong in one space and values belong in a completely different space. When, you know, from the beginning of my own work, looking at environmental law and policy, I realized that this was not a tenable distinction, that coupled to every fact that we find about the environment are normative understandings about how to go about collecting those facts in the first place, what building a consensus means, and the purposiveness of looking at the world in different ways. So people talk loosely and lightly about paradigm shifts, but there are these conceptual moments, and, you know, around when Earth Day was first being celebrated was also a time when environmental problems stopped being largely local. So everybody in this audience knows what a NIMBY is, and, you know, the first sort of rearings of environmental thinking were around that notion that environmental problems are encroaching into our backyard, so not in my backyard. But at least since the moon landings, people have begun to recognize the boundedness of the planet, and with that, the systematicity of many of the environmental problems that they may have experienced in different ways. So weather, everybody knew weather all along, but that weather is also climate, is one of these conceptual changes that came about through a kind of linking of scientific exploration with a set of changes in people's understandings of responsibility and what we're responsible for. So ideas of stewardship, and that this has to be on a planetary scale, and where does responsibility lie, and, you know, who is supposed to take care of acting on the knowledges that we produce. These things have been front and center in the political agenda, whether that's been explicitly understood or not. So a lot of the work that's been done on linking science with environmental decision-making has tended to focus on particular kinds of controversies or problems. You know, for instance, in Europe last year and the year before, there's been a lot of focus on just one controversy, glyphosate. I mean, you know, why are some people saying it's a carcinogen or not? This is the active ingredient in Roundup, which was the signature product of Monsanto. But stepping back, looking over the 50-year trajectory of environmentalism, one recognizes that something so pointed as glyphosate is really about a different set of things. It's about the degree to which our technological inventiveness can or should be changing the planet around us, the degree to which the human imprint on the planet has to be thought through as itself something that we need to put under the analytic lens. There's also been a kind of pushback against the sort of intuitive understanding that many of us had, that you should go about making new knowledge, and that is going to lead in and of itself to better policymaking, wiser policymaking. Why is that not the case? Why is it that in 2020, a year that has a lot of resonance because we all know it from eye exam charts as perfect vision, why is it that in 2020, the link between knowing and acting seems to be severed, you know, in a way that Enlightenment thinking would not have allowed us to believe? Why is it that we have a president of the United States who says one of his things, and the next day the medical community of the United States is backtracking to make sure that citizens are not following prescriptions like drinking bleach based on what the president has just managed to utter? So, you know, these are not things that one would have predicted. And I think that the answer is to be found not exclusively anyway, in the corruption of science by private interests. I think the answer is to some extent, or to an equal degree, to be found in what we've allowed to happen to our political institutions, so that you cannot have a robust uptake in society of the kinds of invaluable work that is being done in science and technology without having equal attention given to the robustness of our social institutions. So in the last month or so, the word trust has reappeared in all kinds of news stories about the coronavirus. I mean, who are we going to trust? Which are the trustworthy models, et cetera, et cetera. But trust has always been there in the substrate. And I think that in this moment, the moment of conjunction between an ongoing set of deliberations and thinkings about planetary stewardship and planetary knowledge and this crisis that we've all been flung into, my hope is that we take away the lesson that we have to redevote as much political energy to thinking about what kinds of societies do we want to be based on the knowledge that we're accumulating, and not only how much knowledge and what are the next questions for science and technology. So I'll stop with that for the moment.
Thank you very much. Now, my pleasure to introduce our host for today's event, Professor Elizabeth Wilson. Professor Wilson is a faculty member in the Department of Environmental Studies at Dartmouth University, and she's also the director of the Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy and Society. Her work examines how energy systems are changing in the face of new technologies and new societal pressures, with a focus on the implementation of energy and environmental policies and laws in a practical sense. And Elizabeth is also someone that I did not know prior to this. I honestly don't remember the chain of events that led me to you. I'm sure that you were recommended by one or more people, and anyway, so I'm delighted that you're here, however it is that we managed to connect. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here as well. And I also appreciate that we're talking about this book chapter, our book chapters, Earth 2020, at a really unique point in human history. If a pandemic happens once every 100 years, thinking about the future of the planet now really provides an important and salient viewpoint, I think, for this conversation. There's a few points that I want, that I tried to cover in the book chapter that I wrote with Elias Grove Nielsen. And I think the most important one that I just want to make sure that we leave with, and this echoes Typo's earlier comments, but that now is an energy anomaly. For the last 10,000 years of humans on the planet, this is the anomaly. This is not normal. And really, when we think about how humans have organized our societies for the last 10,000 years, human labor, animal labor were really the forces that drove our societies. We've always been working towards having energy to do things, but most of us were slaves or serfs or peasants who were providing that basic energy. There were important gendered roles in terms of the work that we did. And when you think about how we use energy today to travel around the world, to make each other into postage stamps and Zoom each other all across the planet, to light our homes and houses, this is the anomaly in that story. And it has allowed an incredible level of access to people who weren't traditionally part of the progress conversation. But with that progress idea, of course, always comes regress. And when I think about the energy story, it's easy to think about the externalities. And today, as you hear the stories of towns in India who are seeing the Himalayas for the first time in 30 years because of the absence of air pollution around the world that WHO estimates prematurely kills 4.2 million people a year. You appreciate the cost of our energy system on our human lives and livelihoods as we go forward as well. And with this progress regress comes our dependence on energy. We use energy for everything now. Refrigeration of our foods, pumping of our waters, lighting of our homes. And since the first Earth Day back in 1970, our energy increase per capita has increased 45%. And when we think about, and you know, Typo also talked about the resulting greenhouse gas increase at that time, from 1970 levels of 320 parts per million to today over 410 parts per million. So our energy use having enormous consequences on our material well-being, but also on the history and the functioning of the planet. In 2018, energy use increased another 3%. And as we're thinking about the need to transition our energy system to carbon-free or sustainable systems in the world, I think it's important to understand the very different contexts within which energy is used in our societies. Oftentimes we spend a lot of time talking about the 2.2 billion of us that really have too much energy. We fly all over the world. We have access to computers, embedded devices like our cell phones. Or we'll talk about the 1.1 billion that don't have any access to modern electricity, or the 2 to 3 billion people on the planet that don't have access to modern cooking fuels. But really, I think it's also important to consider the 4.4 billion people in the middle who don't have enough energy and whose desire for energy-rich lives is really what is leading and growing the trajectories going forward. So while the 2.2 billion may have caused the problem, when I flip on the light switch, I expect light. That 4.4 billion in the middle may or may not have reliable access to energy as they go forward. And so my PhD student in Nepal would often talk about in Kathmandu, they used to have schedules in the city of what hours a day you would have access to electricity. So appreciating that our energy realities differ significantly depending where you are on the planet. With that said, the transition story has been one that we often focus on as we have moved from wood to coal to other sources of energy. But globally, this has not been substitutive, but it's been additive. We use as much wood today, even more globally. We use as much coal today, even more globally, even though in North America, we have shifted away. And so when we're thinking about this additive, not substitutive change, it makes the need to reduce emissions all that much harder as we go forward. And so when we're thinking about our energy challenges going forward, energy to provide basic livelihoods, energy to ensure that we can all breathe the air that we're taking into our lungs, energy to ensure that there's space for others on the planet. We're now locked into a world that is not only looking at mitigating the emissions from our current energy system, but adapting to the climate changes that we have already pushed onto the planet. And as Taipom mentioned earlier as well, our infrastructure wasn't built for the world that we are going into. And so what we have done thus far is a lot, and it is completely insufficient for the challenge facing us today. So when we're working with the students, when we're working with each other, this ability to think about this next century's challenge of creating sustainable energy systems has to be in concert with the other voices of civil society, of Native populations, of science and civil society. And so I look forward to the conversation that we'll be having now for the next 25 minutes. And please send your questions to a chat. Stephanie will be forwarding to us and we'll have the conversation now. So thank you everybody for coming, being part of this conversation. And thank you, Philippe, for pulling this together. This has been a project that's pushed all of us to think about the world in new ways, and I'm very thankful for that.
Great, thank you. So as I understand now, some questions, the floor will be open to questions. You can send those to Stephanie, who will pass them to Elizabeth on a different continent, as I understand, and all of us somewhere in the middle will have an opportunity to join that conversation. So we've got about 20 minutes for those questions, and I will probably come back for just about 60 seconds at the end to wrap up and wish you well. So perhaps there's some questions in already.
Yep. First question from Dick Clapp for Professor Jasanoff. Will it be possible to transition from a political economy of growth to a political economy of stewardship?
Well, I am most famous, I think, for having written an article called Technologies of Humility, in which I say we should not go overboard trying to predict things, but should stick instead to, well, not instead, but should devote more energy to thinking about distributive consequences of the things that we undertake so blithely. So I wouldn't presume to answer, is it going to be possible? Do we need to try? Yes, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that we need to pay attention to in this present crisis is that we've been, in essence, handed a natural experiment in all of the kinds of things that people were saying we needed to do for the sake of climate change, right? I mean, so reduce travel, reduce energy use, eat more sustainably, consume less. All of these things have been thrust upon us on almost 24 hours notice. And one of the questions, could society do it or not, has been answered with an overwhelming yes, partly because society has been forced to do it. But we also know that the consequences have fallen, as in all crises, much more heavily on the poor and the vulnerable than on the rich and well-heeled, which most of us in this audience are. So I think that this question of, at what price, at what cost, those normative questions need to be put really seriously back on the calendar now that we have a kind of answer to, can this be done? Yes, lots of things can be done, but it doesn't it doesn't begin to address how much of it should be done and who should be doing it. I think for the richer parts of society, the fact that we've done it, I hope, will be a welcome wake-up call to say, yes, we can do more belt tightening than we've been willing to do in the past.
Thank you. Next question for Tapio. Will remote work change our global energy consumption, and how?
That's an interesting question. I mean, you hear it a lot that the nature of work will change with all that. I'm not so sure. We're in a team of 50 people in my group or so, and we are living off the fact that we all had very close personal ties built in office space we shared for a long time that makes it possible to work efficiently and effectively remotely now. We're drawing on social capital we built, and I think we all realize, well, we can work. We are fortunate we can do our work very well, but we'll all be glad to see each other more again. I think there's some case to be made that we all travel too much, and that's something that easily can go. I think a lot of it can go. That will be good, but keep in mind that global emissions from aircraft are 2% or so of the total. That's not going to solve the problem on itself. I think there will be some aspects where we can reduce emissions, work more sustainably by using technological tools. But the problem we are facing here is so large that is away from being enough. The only solution there really is finding a way of generating energy. Electricity probably would have to be primarily from sunlight or other renewable sources. Sunlight is the one that we have plenty of. That has to happen. Once we have that, I think we can transition to a more sustainable energy economy.
Yeah, I mean, I note that aviation fuel is down 75% now globally. And so the massive change in how we're traveling is something that's really huge. For Deboarh McGregor, how do you react to or think about the climate change discourse that's centered around Western science's way of understanding this crisis? Do you see tension between these articulations and Indigenous articulations of climate change?
Thank you for that question. It's a good one. I think about it in different ways. I do think that the science story has dominated, and I wouldn't say, I don't say that's a wrong story. It's just kind of, you can see my hands, a limited story is how I kind of explain it. Like, what are the other kind of stories that need to come into the conversation? And so some work is starting to be generated around that. IPCC's made an explicit effort to now try to include Indigenous knowledge into the assessments. In Canada, I'm contributing to some of those assessments and trying to include Indigenous knowledge, because I know we don't have everything that I think Sheila mentioned this. We don't have everything that or maybe we do. It's like I think people have trouble envisioning what the transformation can look like. And I think Indigenous peoples kind of have that because we've had to do it in a really short order. Like in Canada, we've had to transform massively in order to survive. to be who we are today still as a nation. So there's knowledge embedded within that I think can be informative, can inform other people who are trying to envision what can that possibly look like. So I tend to look at it as Indigenous knowledges of Indigenous peoples, and even non-Indigenous knowledges of non-Indigenous peoples are relevant to this conversation as well. As how does that contribute to this unfolding of the story that we're trying to understand right now? How can our knowledges contribute to hopefully helping the earth and ourselves go in a transformative and different direction that's needed. So I think now it's just kind of, the way I would describe it, it's in the radar. You know, people know they need to do this. Same with the IPBS report on ecosystem and services also was trying to consider Indigenous peoples and their knowledge into these kind of processes. But I think they still tend to look at it as kind of data. They don't see that it's actually societal, that there's actually ontological value systems that are part of it as well. I think, yeah, Sheila was sort of talking about this as well, way more eloquently than I am. So that part also needs to be part of it, like the societal part of it, like what also has to change in terms of governance, in terms of how we understand our relationship, like essential to Anishinaabeg thinking, which I can speak to best because that's what I am, is this: we have this concept where we don't keep thinking about what we're going to take from the earth. Like, part of our thinking is, what are we going to contribute back to earth? What can we do to actually sustain the earth? Like, what can we do to actually help the earth recover from what we're doing? I guess you can think about it as sort of being mitigation, but it's actually more than that. So how can these different kind of philosophical understandings impact more than just how can Indigenous knowledge be data and the kind of assessments that people are doing? Yeah, so I think that's the best way I can explain it. I think it's there. People are trying. I see people are trying to do it because I know they are, because they're saying, how does Indigenous knowledge fit into forestry for IPCC assessment? So, but also thinking about all these knowledges that are all part of the story, and they need to be valued as part of the story, as opposed to privileging some over the others, but really to, again, it's a moment to be more, to understand what the limitations that we've had and how we need to be a lot broader in our thinking and really trying to tell, I think, kind of a different story. So hopefully that was helpful. Thank you. It's a good question.
No. Thank you. There's a question on the current infrastructure for Tapio and me. When you say that our current infrastructure is not ready for the sustainable future, which aspects of our infrastructure do you think are most dire? You can go first.
Climate change is moving relatively slowly, right? We're talking about decadal timescales. So when you're talking about vulnerable infrastructure, it's primarily things that last for decades. So what this means is, for example, stormwater management infrastructure, where storm drains are sized for the storms we used to have. You're expecting more intense storms in many parts of the world. The storm drains are not large enough to handle the runoff coming from it. Sea level rise is likewise slowly progressing. There are various plans for building seawalls around New York or in Miami. That's infrastructure investments that will become necessary to protect those areas. And then, of course, the developing world is at enormous risk. Say, take Bangladesh, where you have well over 10 million people living within a few feet of sea level without the means to protect themselves with the technology that in principle exists, levees and the like. And there, the infrastructure and adaptation question becomes, I think, an enormous challenge. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I wanted to just add on to that a little bit. I mean, when you see these fundamental changes in big weather systems, the National Academies had a wonderful session looking at the upper Mississippi and the Rio Grande, and how changes in water mean that the future going forward is not the future the entire system has been designed for. And so they gave the example of Davenport, Iowa last year having been at flood stage for 220 days. And this is because of how we have chosen to manage the watershed system in the upper Mississippi, but none of it is built for the world we're moving into. And from an energy perspective, your system reliability goes down significantly if your substation is underwater or your transmission lines are on fire. And so there's a lot of real vulnerability there too.
Yeah, that's a good point. Go ahead.
No, please.
Yeah, maybe an intuitive way of saying what Elizabeth, I think, was saying is, for example, water management infrastructure is built, there's always the 100-year risk or maybe 50-year or 100-year flood for which people plan. But what used to be a 100-year flood will become a 10-year flood or so. And we're not ready for it. Power lines, that's actually another good example. They're affected also by heat, not just by fire, their efficiency. And it's yet another example of where infrastructure is not well adapted to what's coming.
Well, and I think also, as you were mentioning, the infrastructures in developing countries that can be even more fragile. It's not only the first order effects of a big storm coming through Mozambique, it's the second order effects of cholera outbreaks that come from these incredible floods and inability to access people and help them. So thinking not only about the system going out, but what the concurrent health and human impacts are on those very fragile systems. We had another question. This one is for you, Typo. Many years ago, Wally Broker said that carbon sequestration, now called negative emission technology, is essential because of the difficulty in mitigating emissions. What do you think about the prospects of NET?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Wally, for those who don't know, Wally was one of the giants, maybe the most giant of the giants in our field. He passed away recently, a few months ago. And he was a friend of mine. He had an interesting old-fashioned way of doing science. It was calling people, and it's a number of people he called. And I was one of them. And the last few years of his life, he had been advocating carbon sequestration. Let's get the carbon out of the atmosphere and put it somewhere. But at some point he said, look, the scale of the problem is everyone is emitting these 10 mid-sized passenger cars worth of carbon into the atmosphere. And you somehow have to get that out. That times 7 billion or billions of people. The scale of the problem is so enormous. We just can't do it soon enough. That was his take. So the last 2 years of his life, actually, he was very passionate and about and dedicated towards alternatives to that. And he became very interested in geoengineering, modifying the amount of sunlight Earth absorbs as a way to buying some time. It's sort of the, I don't know, that's maybe the social distancing of climate research is geoengineering. And Wally was thinking this is the better way for carbon sequestration. I think in the long run, so my own view here is, in the long run, what we need is cheap ways of producing electricity from renewable sunlight primarily. Once you can do that very cheaply, much more cheaply than what fossil fuels cost now, then that opens up a whole host of things we can do. The problem with getting carbon out of the atmosphere is that it costs energy, and that has to come from somewhere. But if you produce electricity cheaply from sunlight, then you can perhaps produce so much of it that you can begin sucking carbon out of the atmosphere effectively. But that would be decades from now before that can be done at scale, I think.
I'll just jump in to add that there's a dedicated chapter in the book about geoengineering by Douglas McMartin and Kate Rick, and it addresses not just the scientific issues that Tapio has raised, but also some of the social, ethical issues.
I'm going to ask one more question and then change it back to Philippe, and then we're out of time. But I think these are great conversations that we're all hungry to have. So thank you very much, everybody. Last question, I think, is for Sheila and Deborah. I'm curious to hear more about how high-up movements to give legal rights to elements of nature have gained support. Are there countries where that's been shown to drive significant change in climate policy?
So there are some countries that have given rights to nature in varying ways, but in terms of effects, it's much more ambiguous. So you can go from something like Ecuador's constitution that gives rights to natural resources to more selective things like granting constitutional rights to primates, or saying that there must be some kind of explanation that or responsibility on the part of citizens towards nature, which is there in the Indian Constitution. But these are often fairly recent or new provisions. They haven't, they don't carry with them a history of how things ought to be articulated. I think that rather than dwelling too much on these new provisions, which are philosophically exciting and important, one might equally look at the ways in which, without explicitly saying that natural resources have rights, nevertheless, we have in effect articulated such beliefs. So for instance, I think the whole idea of the precautionary principle, which is much more widespread and which I think has had effects, can be said to be resting on that kind of idea of responsibility towards the earth and towards a need to look for alternatives when we think we're going too far and inflicting too much damage. One of the political questions that interests me is the, in some ways, inexplicable standoff between North America, well, not North America, the United States part of North America, and Europe on this question of the precautionary principle. And I think it's deeply misunderstood in the US what Europeans mean by the precautionary principle. Of course, the Europeans don't help by having multiple meanings, but nevertheless, I would sooner, I mean, for more sort of immediate handholds on law and public policy, I would sooner turn there than to the relatively less tested constitutional prescriptions and prohibitions, which don't yet have the interpretive infrastructure to back them up, in my view. And just one comment on the previous discussions about infrastructure, I do think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we're not only talking about storm drains, right? I mean, that is the infrastructure for accommodating the kinds of changes we're looking to include social institutions as well, such as, for instance, what are the liability provisions and the insurance provisions for the kinds of damage that we're looking at, and what kinds of social connectivity or resilience infrastructures do we have. And there are examples already of disasters that have happened that show that even countries with relatively vulnerable or weak physical infrastructures can nevertheless cope with certain kinds of challenges better because they have communitarian social infrastructures. And I think that goes back, Tapio, to your point that even though Zoom allows us to have these virtual connections, you and your group are dying to get back to personal connections. So I don't want to lose sight of that need for the social infrastructures to be attended to every bit as much as the material ones.
I want to make sure that Philippe has his moments to close. Thank you, everybody, for a wonderful discussion, and to Philippe.
Right. Well, just maybe 30 seconds to wrap up. And first and foremost, to thank everyone for participating in the conversation, to all of the contributors to the book. It is indeed an interesting time to be having this discussion. It's abundantly clear now, if it wasn't before, that we're all sitting in the same bathwater together. And that means that the only way forward clearly is together. And that notion, I think, does fly very much in the face of some rising trends of nationalism and isolationism. And I hope very much that each of us can do our part to strike out against those tendencies, to recognize that there is value from many perspectives, from many parts of the world, and sometimes the most useful things that we hear are the most unanticipated. So let us celebrate serendipity and free exchange of ideas, because I think in that we'll find some surprises that may be helpful in this very difficult journey that we have in front of us. So thank you once again. And it's been a real pleasure and honor to be a part of this.
Thanks, Philippe.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you for hosting. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.